Welcome, everyone. Great to have the folks here in the room. Certainly encourage in-person participation. It's really fun. The networking is better, I promise, relative to those online. So please do, if you can, come out next time. Speaking of upcoming events or the next times, tonight we are having a DABE happy hour starting at about 5 p.m., though I'm sure we'll be there for a while, so stop by whenever you can, at 5430 Rooftop Bar. It is on the 20th floor of Le Meridian Hotel in downtown Denver. Do bring a jacket in case it's a little chilly up there, but should be a lot of fun. Again, 5430 Rooftop Bar in Le Meridian Hotel. And some other upcoming events. On Wednesday, April 17th, we have a lunch event here with the director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is an exciting event. He's flying in from DC, so we're really lucky to have him. Hoping to pack the room and give him a good showing. He'll be speaking about some of the lesser known BEA data products, and then also I think looking to have a conversation about the existing data products as well. So bring your commentary, bring your questions. Another upcoming event, Wednesday, May 15th, a lunch event with Phyllis Resnick, talking about the Colorado Disproportionate Impact Indicator, a cool interactive tool to see how different projects or programs might affect communities based on geography in the state of Colorado. So two very cool upcoming events, and we've got more in store for you. Currently working on some planning for the summer events, and we'll have more details about that likely the next time. Few more administrative announcements. First, the economic forecast competition is underway and it will close at the end of this month. So if you haven't submitted your picks, your forecast picks, please do. Always a fun thing. If you win, you get the bragging rights and get to keep a plaque with your name on it and prior winners for at least a year. So that's exciting. Please, let's get some more competition out there. So again, it's closing. I'm sure that there'll be more announcements about it, but it's closing at the end of this month. Finally, last admin announcement is to if you're remote, please put your questions in the chat along the way. We'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dave Hansen to introduce our speaker.
All right, hi everybody. I am really excited to introduce Luke. For those of you that don't know Luke, I first met him a while back through the Denver Association of Business Economists when he was at the Office of State Planning and the Governor's Office of State Planning and Budgeting, and then with Jason Schrock, who many of you know. And so I have run across his work over the years. He was before founding Thrive Economics, he was the Chief Economist and Deputy Director over at OSPB. And so he would participate in quarterly forecasts of the Joint Budget Committee with Legislative Council staff. And he worked on Proposition 123, which passed in 2022 for affordable housing. It was to try and find a sustainable source of revenue for affordable housing. And then, currently there is a property tax commission going on at the state capitol, and he presented on land value tax for this property tax commission. So we are really excited to hear about it today for our membership. And with that, I will turn it over to Luke. Thanks, Luke. There you go.
Great. Well, thanks, David. Very excited to be here to talk about economics and property taxes, taxation in general. Always fun to talk about. So I was asked to talk about land value taxation, largely based on some work that I've already done around this. But I think some of the big questions that we're asking around this is this a better way to do property taxes? Can this help us solve the housing affordability crisis? So that's kind of what I want to ultimately get to, but kind of by going along through some of the real basic concepts behind it. Oops. I must be hitting the wrong button here. There you go. There we go. All right, thank you. So just for the kind of initial background context for all this, for the question of like, is this a solution to our housing crisis? I want to set a little bit of, what is going on with our housing crisis? So, the basic answer, not enough homes available in the places where people want them. So the high demand locations, we have a very inelastic supply of housing, supply of land that is perfectly fixed. And so when demand for living in those areas go up, you either have housing supply go up or by increasing the density and spreading that higher land cost, that higher demand over more units, or you just have higher housing prices if you don't increase that supply through more density. So when we have, this is a big conversation at the state level right now around land use regulations and housing supply. When we do have these barriers to increasing housing density, it kind of means that the only outlet for that extra demand is to push prices up. So you can see the graph at the bottom here. I really like how you see the left side, perfectly elastic supply there going from point A to point B. Demand goes up and supply perfectly matches it. So prices stay the same. The right side here, looking at the angle of that supply line from A to B, gets more inelastic. So you see that turns out to higher price, fewer homes. What we're going to be talking about a lot in this conversation is with land and the supply of land being perfectly fixed. So that line is just completely vertical for land here, which has a lot of implications for taxing land, which we'll get into. So for just from a high level of how current property taxes work, I think it's really critical to think of it as a combination of two different taxes. There's both the tax on the land of your property and a tax on the improvement value of your property. That is just very important because, as we'll talk about in a minute, like these have very different economic effects and create very different economic incentives. What is relevant that I think a lot of people don't know is that these are actually already assessed separately in Colorado on your property tax statements. So our Colorado assessors are already accounting for those separately. So, theoretically, we could apply different tax rates or different assessment rates to each of those components. We don't do that, but at least that's possible. So we will talk a little bit as we go on just about the different incentives that are created just based on the ratio between that land value and that improvement value. So that's really just a core concept I want to start off with. And then, so what are those different economic incentives that they create and different economic effects? So you've got the tax on improvement values. And so the saying goes, like, if you want less of something, tax it. And we see that with improvements here, where if you're looking at housing supply and affordability, like let's say you've got an empty lot or an underdeveloped lot and you're looking to build housing on it, well, your tax bill is going to go up quite a bit once you actually, go from something that's vacant or underutilized or blighted into something that's, a nice new housing development. You see that same incentive of kind of like pushing people towards minimizing their improvement value, or at least kind of trying to avoid that extra tax liability where possible, means that you end up with less density in the core of cities and more kind of pushing towards the outer boundaries. So more vacant land in urban centers, more sprawl towards exteriors. The impact on renters, the effect of this tax penalty for development is we end up with less housing, so rents are higher. So some of that, you could say, the tax on improvements does kind of carry an impact on renters, where it kind of can pass through in that sense through the higher rents. But for the tax on the land values, and we'll talk about this more in a second, since the supply of land is fixed, there is no penalty for development there. That does not actually reduce your housing supply at all then. And so there's no pass through, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then finally, like it's a very disincentivizes that productive growth and investment as well. So looking at the tax incidence, the way that you can determine who's actually bearing the cost of a tax is by looking at the relative elasticity. So think of like kind of who is more price insensitive. So it's kind of example I always use, like the gas tax. Like if drivers aren't going to drive any less when the gas tax goes up, then they're bearing the entire cost of that gas tax. If they actually drive less, and there's less gas sold then the suppliers bear some of that too. So this matters because when you're taxing land by itself, the supply of land is fixed. So, the supply of land then is perfectly price insensitive. So that means that tax actually cannot be passed through to renters, which is really sounds kind of extreme or bizarre, but we've actually seen that in empirical evidence as well. So I won't go into these too much, but these are a couple of studies out of Europe, one from Germany and one from the Netherlands, where they actually looked at the extent to which property taxes and land taxes were capitalized into rents. So the study on the left is looking at Germany, and that was actually in the context of a rent control regime as well, where rising land taxes were one of the only reasons why a landlord would be allowed to raise their rent beyond the limit. So you'd really expect, like, kind of, if you would see that pass through anywhere, you would see that here. But really, they were not able to. And so that kind of just shows that I think the best way to explain this is to say that rents are not set by kind of a cost plus pricing model, whereas, like, as the landlord's costs go up for renting out their unit, and then they add 3% or 5% or whatever on top of that, rents are really set by the market. So it's by supply and demand. Landlord operating costs are just mostly independent of that. So if this tax is borne entirely by the landlords, it just kind of reduces that surplus, but it doesn't actually change the value of the unit to the renter. The study on the right was really interesting as well, because it was some very, there were some surveys of land in the Netherlands. They ended up having some borders of their jurisdictions change a little bit. So they were able to look at what actually happened to the value of the homes in those areas where the price rate changed, nothing else changed. And again, found that the full cost of the land tax was borne by the owner of land. It did not change the user cost of land at all. So beyond just the incidents, I think one of the other big questions is that always comes up with this is kind of like, who wins, who loses if you shift from, like, a property tax as it currently exists towards prioritizing taxes on land versus taxes on improvements, or maybe giving more tax breaks to improvement values. And that really depends on how intensively developed a site is. So it's that ratio of improvement value to total value. So generally, sites where their improvement value is a larger percentage of your total value will see a tax reduction in the context of a revenue neutral tax shift, at least. And while taxes will rise if your land is a higher percentage of your overall property value. So I think the way I think about this is, like, looking out the window here and seeing all the big parking lots that are on Ball Arena, like, this is a very high value part of the city. This is the type of place where that land value is is a much higher percentage of the total property value there. So you're likely to see places like downtown parking lots get developed, whereas places where there are already more dense development on it will likely see tax reductions. And finally, just a visual here. I think the other question that comes up a lot is kind of like, what does it mean if you were, like, only taxing land values? Like, where is that? Who pays that? So got this graphic here from the assessor's office in Denver, really looking at where the assessed values are for land in Denver. And one of my takeaways of this, looking at this, was I think these are actually pretty good. I think these actually fit a lot of what my intuitions would have been about the places where land values are highest. You can clearly see kind of the downtown core. You can see Cherry Creek. You can see some of the main transit and commercial corridors there. I think the short answer for kind of where land values are highest are where there's the most amenities, like where people most want to be. And so getting back to that initial question a little bit and just kind of saying it a little more directly is right now we carry a tax penalty for development. Like if you're going to develop, you need to be prepared to pay a lot more taxes when you do so. If you're only taxing land, or if you're taxing land at a much higher rate than taxing buildings, that penalty gets reduced. So there's more of an incentive to both maintain and redevelop properties, and less of an incentive to kind of like just let them deteriorate or fall into disuse or disrepair. And again, like the effects of this are mostly concentrated in high value locations, is where these effects will be most pronounced. Got a couple of slides here looking at some studies just on what has happened when we've done this in the real world. So this, at least in the US, has still not been very common. There are about 20 jurisdictions, mostly in Pennsylvania, that have done this. Most of them have done a split rate tax where land has been taxed at a higher rate than improvements, rather than like a full kind of pure land value tax. But we've gotten some good studies out of that, and now, as we'll talk about in a minute, Detroit is trying to move towards this system as well. So first of all, looking at this paper on the left, really interesting. They looked at basically the implicit land taxes. And so the way they're assessing that is you can think of the way just economies and property values change over time. You know, in Denver, we've had a surge in property values. You know, most of that is going to the land. Like the value of my house has gone up a lot the last 5 years. That's not because my house got any nicer. It's just because like that land value has surged as there's been more demand to live here. And so they look at that implicit ratio between land and improvements for metro areas, and really found like higher density, neighborhood diversity, business formation, really much better economic performance for places that had kind of implicitly higher land taxes. And then in Pennsylvania, looking at those jurisdictions specifically that move towards a split rate tax, something very similar. You know, more housing construction, more office construction, denser development, more new business formation, higher property values overall. Really finding some kind of very pro economic growth effects from this. And probably the biggest example is Pittsburgh. They repealed their land value tax a few years ago, but before that, they had gotten up to almost 2.5 times the tax rate for land as improvements. And the studies that we got from that have been really pretty positive. Higher housing construction, more commercial office buildings, you know, really has been deemed kind of a large contributor towards Pittsburgh and their success with transitioning away from the very manufacturing-based kind of Rust Belt economy. And then for economists, this has tended to be a pretty broadly supported idea, which makes it kind of fun to work on. So you can see at we've both got quotes from Paul Krugman here saying that land value taxation could be the right approach to finance city growth. Milton Friedman called it the least bad tax, which is rousing praise from Milton Friedman. Daryl Fairweather is the chief economist at Redfin. She's something of a land value tax crusader. She calls it the tax policy that can fix housing, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. I think is a little bit overstated, but certainly a high profile voice arguing in favor of this. And then also I mentioned Detroit kind of trying to move towards this system. There's a survey of economists from the University of Chicago and finding that like 83% of them agree that this is going to substantially help their economy. And so, you know, as we think about policy options, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, just because, you know, policies are easy to come up with. The politics of passing and implementing policies is a lot harder. So I think one of the just things that I want to keep in mind here is that there is a whole array of possible approaches that this can take. This kind of principle that the supply of land is fixed and that different tax rates and different tax structures incentivize different things when you're taxing that land. So list just a bunch of different possibilities here for policies that could kind of leverage this economic distinction. But really, I think the key thing is, you know, just in general, that very broad concept of when we're doing our property taxes, like kind of taxing land at a higher rate than buildings, or finding ways to give exemptions to buildings but not to the land, is a much better way of doing this just economically. And so getting back to kind of the questions we started with, we asked, like, is it a better tax? Is it a way to solve the housing crisis? And I think that's kind of a key distinction. I think in my mind, this fits better within the context of property taxes than within the context of solutions to the housing crisis. I think that when you're comparing it against kind of our traditional property taxes, you've got very strong arguments for saying this is much, much more efficient. There's no dead weight loss at all, as compared to, basically any other tax. There are, like, this can be a boost to so many other policy goals that we have, like housing affordability, economic development, just efficient land use and kind of density to reduce transportation emissions. There are so many beneficial aspects that this policy can help incentivize and help move us closer towards, that I think there's a pretty strong argument for it being a better form of property tax. When you're talking about in the context of housing crisis and solutions for the housing crisis, I think it gets a little bit more nuanced. I think it depends a lot on geography and kind of like what the binding constraint in a given area is. Because, you can look at this and say, great, this creates a financial incentive for real estate investment and real estate development. Well, that already exists in quite a lot of areas. In a lot of these highest demand areas where our housing crisis is most acute, there are already pretty big incentives to get that housing built. It's just that there's political constraints on doing so. And that's getting back to this like land use and zoning issue where generally it's not the fact that the housing won't pencil, it's that it's just really hard to get it through the local processes. And then, so I think that means that there's a geographic distinction where in a lot of the kind of really high demand urban cores in urban areas where we're seeing the most acute housing crisis, like it can be a helpful thing. Like it still creates all those incentives that we talked about. But I don't think it's kind of the silver bullet. But for places that might be a little bit more underinvested, or struggling with kind of almost want to say like kind of the other end of the challenge there, this can, I think, be much more effective. And this gets towards the example of Detroit earlier, and they're trying to move towards this. I think when you raise that tax on land, if you've got a blighted or vacant site, you're raising the carrying cost of that land. Like a lot of land investors, land speculators, looking at just kind of holding onto a site until it becomes more valuable. And there's a real last mover advantage for sellers. Like, if you've got the last place in Rhino right now, like you want to hold on to it until everything else is around it, then it's the only one. Versus if you're, maybe in Lodo back when Hickenlooper was building his brewery, like, that was a much more risky venture than kind of building one there now. So there's a real last mover advantage for sellers. You can get a much higher price. This can get at that a little bit by raising that carrying cost of land, and kind of spur current owners to either develop it or sell it to someone who will. So I think as potential for solving the housing crisis, it probably depends on context. And so I want to leave plenty of time for questions just because there always are a lot. But I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this online, but this primer on the right on land value taxes is what Stephen Hoskins, another economist out of New Zealand, and I presented to the Commission on Property Tax a couple months ago. That's a link to the full memo there if we can click on that. But yeah, so feel free to read that. Feel free to ask questions. Greg.
Hey, Luke. Thanks for your presentation. This is Greg Sabetsky for all the people in TV land. So I have a lot of questions about implementation that I'd love to get to if there's time for it later in the session today, and I know that there are questions online too. I have one question about you've posited this as a better way to perform taxation. I think that you've made, from my perspective, a pretty compelling argument about what this incentivizes and disincentivizes in the market. One thing that I contemplate a lot when considering taxes isn't just what sort of economic decisions they motivate, but rather their reliability and consistency as a source of government funding. And one of the things, like the reason the Commission on Property Taxation is doing its work right now is in response to what like constituents in Colorado have widely perceived to be too fast of an increase in property valuations and in property tax burden. You know this better than I do. How volatile are land values relative to improvement values? I would expect that land values are more responsive to the economy than improvements are, increase more quickly than improvement valuations do during expansions, decrease more quickly than improvement valuations do during crashes. And how do you and other LBT advocates address like the revenue volatility component from a government funding side and the tax responsibility volatility component from a taxpayer side?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So as for kind of, I think the fundamental question there is about just the volatility and kind of how that affects all parties. I think that first of all, the land values tend to be much more sensitive to demand changes than improvement values. I would say though that as far as like where this falls on the spectrum of various sources of public revenue and how volatile they are, property taxes tend to be pretty stable. I would put this like probably a little bit more volatile than our current property tax system, but still much more stable than like our income tax system or things like that. As for I think the other side, or the other kind of response I'd have to that, is a lot of our volatility in property values, it is coming from the fact that when we have such inelastic supply of housing, it makes it so that all of those demand changes get translated into value changes. So if we can make supply more elastic, or kind of get a little bit out of this shortage context, we lose some of that volatility there by making it easier to build into the boom times. And so I think that this is like, to the extent that we're saying this kind of can help with the housing shortage, I think this also helps with those property valuation swings, which just get kind of more severe, I think, the larger shortage you have.
Yeah, I mean, I find that compelling, right? As an economist who's coming to a DABE event, right? Like, I think where policymakers run into an issue is sort of like the perception is fair or unfair, and I imagine that you would just disagree with this perspective from the outset, that like taxpayers are being burdened with higher valuations sort of through no fault of their own. I own a single family home in the city and county of Denver, so in an urban part of the state, but not the urban core. I don't own a giant empty parking lot next to Ball Arena. You've now even exacerbated the problem of like, well, there's more demand for living in this city, and so we're going to increase your valuations in response to that without you necessarily having more financial resources in order to keep up with the burden of that taxation, and without the city necessarily incurring more costs just because it has become a more desirable place to live. And so the amount of revenue that's being generated isn't really responsive to like government need or ability to pay. It's sort of responsive to economic conditions in order to incentivize these kinds of infill projects. Again, more compelling to me, I think, than to taxpayer advocates. And I wonder what you would say to people like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I think the idea, or part of the idea that we've seen in some of the other places that have moved towards this, is that, I mean, I'm trying to think specifically which study. I think it was the Netherlands study that I showed earlier, but there was a study that found that also total property values were higher. So like as you get more of that infill development, that also raises land value near it. So that kind of helps with some of that volatility question. But to your point about like from a taxpayer advocate view, that leans more into the problem of why did my taxes go up when I had nothing to do with it. So I think that that is kind of one of the big political challenges of this. First of all, like I think we've been trying to be very clear, but like this does not kind of get rid of any of the other tools or kind of like exemptions or credits that we use in our property tax system. where we can still, do our senior homestead exemption and things like that. But I think that politically, I think the way that we would actually have to get to this would not be kind of like a immediate, like we're taxing land at 2.5 times the rate of buildings or anything like that. I think it would have to be kind of a much more gradual process, both for, first of all, just like education and understanding of stuff. And so that you see less of like a sudden shock for certain people. But I think that that also would help for this just being less different from the status quo, kind of until a new status quo is established and kind of a much more gradual transition in. But yeah, I think politically that's definitely one of the main reasons we haven't seen this in more places, despite the economic argument for it being, I think, pretty compelling.
I have a few questions online, so I would like to alternate between online and in person because I would like to give them more. Adrienne, you have a question?
Yeah, I think you partially addressed this, and I want to thank you, first of all, for a really fantastic presentation. This is very interesting. I'm curious why this isn't more widely implemented already. And it sounds to me like a lot of that answer falls back to sort of arguments that go to sort of the NIMBY usual line and developer usual argument. And I will say, just as an aside, it is very interesting that anytime you talk about housing development, the kind of the second thing that anybody will argue about is equity for existing homeowners when it's so apparent, so abundantly apparent that the systems that we have in place already, really just kind of have fallen very badly on the majority of the country, and not just in this country, but kind of around the world. So I'd just be curious to hear sort of your take on why this hasn't advanced further, especially considering how extreme the challenges that we face have become.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good question. And I think that it does come back to just, at least as framed at this high level, where it's kind of like a broad concept of like, oh, we could tax land, not buildings. It becomes very intimidating and hard to explain. I think the complexity is part of it. I think if there were to be a more politically viable path towards this, it would probably start by looking like a building exemption or like a tax cut on buildings, rather than saying you're going to increase the tax rate on land or anything like that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the politics of property taxes, even just with that, with our current property tax system, like we see polling showing that property taxes are like the least popular tax that we have, which, as an economist, I think that's probably my favorite tax. So that's a little bit hard to see. But it does get towards this idea of like, who are your most likely voters? Who are your most likely political donors? Like, who has the loudest voice in the political process? And it really does end up being, a lot of the people who have really kind of made a lot of money through the system as it currently is, and the kind of low property taxes that we have. Whereas, I think a lot of the advantages of this flow through for renters and others who are kind of being squeezed out of the housing market. It's really kind of at best like a no upside scenario. If you own like a single family home in a high value area that's gone up a lot in value, it becomes a much more difficult pitch to make.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
So what is the value of a land value tax in the situation you described where zoning is already capping development? So it's not, a land value tax wouldn't incentivize development that way.
Yeah, I think it's changing the relative patterns of development, or the relative cost of development in different locations. So I don't think, necessarily it can help us get through or kind of like expand the total pipeline of supply, but I think it can change the location sometimes. If you're a developer looking at like, hey, we could do this property, we're going to need to go through a rezoning process, it's going to be a pain, or we can like do this other location here where our taxes might be more favorable under this new regime. Like, I think it can kind of shift those patterns. just based on kind of the existing processes where, you know, so many projects have to go through rezonings anyway, and there's kind of a limited number of developers who are willing and able to navigate that process.
So then, do you imagine the impact on a place like, Boulder, where zoning's already super restrictive, would be like the surrounding areas get more developed as a result of this, or is it?
So you're saying kind of within a context where like maybe there's a city where there's zoning is very, very binding, and then like right next door, there's a place where you're seeing more development?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. I am not sure. I'll have to think about that some. Yeah, because I've generally, yeah, thought of this as kind of like being a statewide thing within kind of a single planning regime. But you're right, there we do have some of these boundary issues in the state currently.
Online, we have Lars. Lars Doucet, online. Can you unmute yourself? Another question.
Thank you. Apologies, I have a cold. But my question is, I work in land valuation actually, but my question is, have you modeled a revenue neutral shift to land taxation in this jurisdiction, like which would be equivalent to a total exemption on buildings, but raise the same amount of dollars of tax? Because a lot of people, you just commented, it's like, okay, it might not be good for, a single family homeowner. I'm not necessarily convinced that the median homeowner wouldn't be better off unless their land allocations are absolutely enormous. In most of the jurisdictions I've modeled, the median homeowner, at least with the revenue neutral shift to land, tends to come out ahead because of how much value is concentrated in the city centers. But I'm less familiar, with what the land allocations look in than you might have experience with. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Everyone heard? Great. Yeah, so that's a good question. We did model it out for Denver. We did not model it out for statewide and what it would look like to change our statewide assessment rates in this way. But for Denver specifically, I think we modeled like a 5-to-1 ratio of land to improvements. And I don't know about the median. I don't quite remember where we ended up there, but there was a substantial percentage of homeowners that would see an increase under this.
Okay. Right. All righty.
Hey, just thinking about Colorado's property tax system and your modeling, and I'd be curious, how do you treat land among different property classes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is my preference would be, I think I would like to be more consistent about across our property classes than our status quo is anyway. I think kind of most notably for this though, I think is probably the agriculture. And we've told people before, I told the Property Tax Commission, like I think we would recommend just kind of excluding that from this process, just because it is so hard to distinguish like what is the improved value of land versus the unimproved value of land.
I'd like to go back to the very basic theory, because I'm still struggling with that. If you go to a full land value taxation system, how do you value the land? And does it mean that it never increases in value because you're disregarding the value of the improvements and the utility of it?
Yeah, so great question. And I would say increasingly there are some really sophisticated modeling techniques to assess the value of land. I think Lars is working on one of those now. So I think we've got some models that are getting pretty good at separating this. And you can think of that like, just even from just kind of like a back of the envelope, simple type of form. Like in my neighborhood, there's an empty lot for sale a couple blocks away. Like I've got a pretty good idea of like, okay, that's like what my property's land itself might be worth. And so for that, I think we can get to an answer there. As for like kind of what does that mean over future years, and like does that mean the land value is kind of like frozen or anything like that? Definitely not. That will change over time as the demand to live in the city and the amenities around the location change. So if again, like if my home got more valuable because they put in a new light rail station next to it or something like that, that would mean my land value goes up again, like even though my house didn't actually change.
Then if you value it based on the infrastructure investments, then you're disincentivizing that. Then all the gentrification stuff starts, screaming again too. It's just I agree with your premise because there's too much. I mean, I'm a developer, and there's too many incentives for a developer to buy cheap land, whether it's in green fields or an infill crummy old site, and just hold it for decades because the value will go up. And if you could just pay the taxes, which aren't too much, then we have a whole cadre of developers that make a living doing that, right? So we need to disincentivize that. So I agree with you, but I just get mixed up in the theory of how you really take the theory and apply it. Where do you start? You say, okay, the land values we said already are where we're going to start. We're not changing land values. Now, what do? We start pumping them up in some places and leaving them alone in others. And then I get confused.
No, I mean, I think I think the NIMBY question, is certainly a fair one. Like, if this is going to increase your property taxes when something nice comes in next to you, do you oppose it in general? I think first of all, there already is kind of an offset near that, like, as like for an investment that will make your neighborhood nicer, like that is harder to oppose. And I would also say that is also how our current property taxes work. Like our current property taxes, like if there's a new like large public investment or something that goes in near you, will send your land value higher and your property taxes higher. So I'm not sure that's so different from the status quo that we're in. Also, like, I think there are policy approaches that could kind of try and mitigate that. We'd have to have the choice to do them though. I think just recently, I guess, was it last year that we voted on the Park Hill Golf Course? They had lots of property tax rebates for the people living nearby, who were going to likely see rising property values come out of that. So just like coming out of that community benefits agreement, you can also more like standardize that in policy. I'm forgetting the name of this now, but there's an idea, at least I don't know if it has actually been done anywhere, where you can take some of the tax increment from new development, which of course there'd be less of if you're like at a pure land value tax system, but take some of that tax increment and use it to like either reduce property taxes for immediate neighbors to the development, or provide some kind of like neighborhood benefit. But really, again, trying to get at that NIMBY issue of how do we get the neighborhood actually to see this as something that is good for them.
We have Rick online as a question. Sorry.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation. Learned a lot and appreciate all the questions. I was just going to do two things. One is in terms of the previous question, it's often confusing distinguishing between assessments and rates, but it's important to understand that right now, assessors figure out the market value of buildings and land, and changing to this approach that's been discussed does not really change the assessments. They'll continue to be done as they are. It's the tax rate applied to land that changed. So we're not changing the land assessments when we move to this system. We're changing the rate applied to land. And I also have an illustration, if a graphic that might make this easier to understand for some people. If the administrator wants me to share my screen, I'd be happy to do that, but I'm also happy to let others ask questions.
Sorry, I have to do it myself.
Am I allowed to share my screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Should be able to now.
Okay. So let me do this, and are people seeing this illustration?
Yeah.
So can people see my cursor on the illustration in the upper left-hand corner moving around?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this talks about how land values are created and how they can be returned and recycled. There are two graphs. The first here, we have the public in this upside down triangle, tenants, landowners, and then owners of prime sites at the bottom. So the public is paying taxes. That's this big green arrow to the government over here. The government uses those taxes to rate public goods and services. Where those public goods and services are location specific, they create land values. A small amount of that gets returned to the public through the property tax. But the lion's share, 80 to 90%, ends up as a windfall to landowners. And what that means is that the public, after they pay taxes for infrastructure, if they want to take advantage of that new infrastructure by locating their home or their business nearby, they have to pay a large rent over here on the left to the owners to get access to the infrastructure they paid for in the first place. So this is what the speaker was talking about in terms of a remedy. You'll notice that the illustration is pretty much the same, except the return of land value to the public sector is much more robust. What this does, it makes infrastructure financially self-sustaining, if not completely, at least to a much bigger degree than it is today. And as a result, taxes on labor and capital can be reduced, which is generally good for the economy. The other thing to note is that because the land values are returned to the public sector, land values do not rise as quickly as they do when land speculation is rampant. As a result, people can get access to the infrastructure with a lower rent payment when you compare these two illustrations. So for people who are having trouble with the theory, I hope that illustration is a little bit helpful. The other, I think, hardest thing to understand about this is the notion that if you increase the tax on land, the land price goes down. And one way to think about this is that people pay for land based on the benefits they expect to receive from owning it. If the tax on land goes up, the benefits of ownership go down, and therefore I pay less or offer to pay less for land after the tax on land is imposed or increased than before. So thanks for letting me chime in here, but great presentation. Thank you so much.
Now, I appreciate that graphic, especially, kind of the large arrow of how the extra land values from extra amenities flows into the landowner values. And so to the extent that government is able to recapture slightly more of that, it doesn't mean that that becomes a negative. Your land values still go up and you still become wealthier.
It's very interesting that a lot of wealthy people say they're opposed to income redistribution. Because when we talk about income redistribution, we're usually talking about taking from the wealthy and giving to the poor. But what this first illustration shows is that they're not at all opposed to the status quo, which is wealth redistribution from the general public to the very affluent. They don't seem to have a problem with that, but that's exactly what's going on here, which is that taxes paid by everyone to benefit the entire community end up giving a huge windfall to owners of prime sites. And then that can be remedied and made more equitable through land value return. Oh, that one last thing. I call this land value return rather than land value tax. If you go to a meeting and people have a problem with unaffordable housing or blight or sprawl, and you say, oh, we can solve this with a land value tax, nobody will hear anything you say after that, because as soon as they hear the word tax, they know, one, I hate taxes, and B, I've heard that taxes are bad for the economy, so we don't want that. So whatever you say after that, people will say no to. So, but if you say land value return, I think it's a little more intuitive, and it implies some fairness, which is that the government is creating these land values, and we're just returning them to the community that created them in the first place.
I want to jump in real quick. there was a comment there that said that expectations kind of create value, right? Our values are informed by our expectations, and if taxes go up, land values should go down. But rates have been going up, and I don't see a lot of land values going down. So I wonder if that's in a bubble, or if that's, you know, in it's not a, I guess, theory and practice just disconnect. Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah,
I
you know,
think-
I'd say that there's a number of different factors that go into that. One of them's, I mean, probably the main one just certainly being this future benefit that you can get out of that. Like, you know, if you upzone a property, the value goes up. If you raise or lower taxes on a property, that changes the rate. I would say that right now, the actual tax rate in Colorado the last few years has been going down. So that probably more contributes to that rather than undermines that.
Adrienne, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh,
I'm
sorry,
not-
sorry.
Are you Adrienne too? Sorry.
That never happens. That's so fun. I was just curious to hear if any of the research that you've done looks at how land value tax interacts with zoning. I noticed in your heat map early on that a lot of the highest value land seemed to include quite a lot of land zoned for high density. And I know a lot of jurisdictions have been considering changing zoning laws as one way to encourage and allow more multifamily housing. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of how a land value tax might interact with some of those initiatives.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the way I primarily think of that is that the reason that densely zoned properties are so valuable is partially because they're so scarce. You know, I think there's been some research finding that when you upzone a small geographic area, you do see large land value increases. But if you do a much more kind of broad-based upzoning, those land value increases are much smaller. And that's largely because then you have, like, if you're a developer looking to build somewhere, you have so many more options that you could be building on. And so it's less of that kind of competition over scarce sites that you see. I'm trying to remember, was there another part of your question that I didn't answer there?
No, that sort of answers it. I was just thinking about other jurisdictions that are thinking about increasing zoning regulations so that they can allow more high density zoning. And it sounds to me like a great path forward would be to implement a land value tax and rezone for greater density kind of at the same time.
Yeah, that sounds great to me.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so kind of hearing all of this, the way that I'm seeing this, it feels like would be a lower incentive to kind of maintain or develop like a single family home in a place like Denver compared to, you know, like a larger apartment building that just takes up like vertical space. So I guess in my mind, that kind of creates a scenario where like only kind of richer, like big corporations would be able to afford and own like a building, and then there would just kind of be less people overall that have equity and like home ownership and more people that are just renting in an area. Am I understanding that wrong, or can you enlighten me on that?
I might not be understanding the question. Can you just say it again?
Yeah. So just in a scenario where like we're taxing the land value more, you're saying that like there's kind of less incentive to have a single family home because it's like taking up the same amount of land, and so your property tax would be like just as high as a tall building that's taking up that same amount of land in Denver, which then that's like harder for us, just like a one homeowner of a single family home, than it would be for a person who owns an entire apartment building and is like receiving revenue from every person who's renting in that building. I guess just like that being said, it seems like that would kind of make it even more difficult for people to find equity through like owning a home, because there would just be like more buildings and less single family homes, which means like more renters and less homeowners.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think the way that I think about the I guess maybe a couple of responses there. I think first of all, just want to kind of emphasize that this changes like the relative cost of building more densely in different areas. So while it might make it more expensive to, own and maintain a single family home kind of in somewhere near downtown Denver, it makes it so that that site likely ends up having more housing units on it instead, which kind of gets back to that like root issue of our housing cost, which is that just supply and demand imbalance, just a shortage of available homes. So like, if we can get like 10 or 20 homes on a site like that, that does a lot more for bringing down cost than having a single family home there. While at the same time, it shifts kind of the geography of where our housing is. So there kind of might be more kind of cheaper land kind of towards the edge of the city or something where, a single family home might be more viable.
And I can kind of build on that. Like, it doesn't have much of an impact on the relative value of building a condo building versus an apartment building. So someone could still own a place in Denver. It just increases the density in places where density is more highly valued. Is that accurate to you?
Yeah, no, I would absolutely say that, there would be no distinction here kind of between, how different forms of multifamily housing or things like that end up paying in. So there's certainly, I would certainly expect some condos to be a part of that. Yeah, it's more of a shifting of kind of what types of housing and what locations are incentivized. And again, I think the other thing that should make this more appealing kind of in abstract to policymakers is it is much more of like an incentive based approach towards meeting some of these policy goals than a lot of the things we try. It's not, I mean, if you're talking to a local government person about like, the state might mandate upzoning for you, or we might shift our property tax rates around, like, they're gonna have questions about like the sustainability of their revenue, but like ultimately it's an incentive that can get them to that end rather than kind of like having a power taken away from them that it would be if the state preempted land use or something like that.
Lars, did you have a question? Oh my God. Lars, did you have a question? I saw several questions, but I'm lost. We asked what?
Oh, no, I was just commenting in the chat, just mentioning how what the speaker was saying is that what the effective LBT causes density to be pulled inward. So for instance, a common thing you'll see is like sprawl coming out of cities that bids up the price of land and therefore housing, but also like farmland gets pushed out because people buy it and convert it into ranch homes. If you have more of that high density in the city center, which LVT incentivizes, even if you never want to live in an apartment, the fact that apartments are getting built where they're supposed to be getting built will take pressure off of where you are, so that that demand will move to where it wants to move. And so you'll take that sprawl pressure off. So if you're in a single family home in that kind of median location, not in the city center, it's plausible. I'd have to see the exact model and exactly where you are, but that density, if it gets pushed where it wants to go, can take actual demand pressure off of where you live. I don't know the exact situation in Denver, but that's the general pattern I've seen.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it reminds me of a point I wanted to make earlier, which is I kind of view land values as an indication of like desired zoning by the market. So like the higher the land values, like kind of the more densely we should be allowing property to be built there. So, you see that map earlier of kind of like downtown Denver, Cherry Creek and stuff like that were darker. I think that's kind of an indication of where people would like to be, for homes, for work, for whatever. And so we should kind of like allow development to happen in those areas.
Luke, thank you so much. I know some folks will drop off right at 1 o'clock, but I think this is a great lively conversation. So I'll add one additional question, but please, for folks who need to go, feel free. It seems as though there could be some variation in how this is implemented. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that, kind of what the variations might look like, what the implications of variations might be. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I mean, like I mentioned in the presentation, like I think there's just any number of different ways you could kind of get at this core concept. I think, one thing that a couple of states have started moving towards and is like, do we let local governments kind of opt in to this type of system, which, has a lot of upside to that approach. That certainly would be politically easier than just saying, the state's going to change the property tax regime to this. But I think it's a question too of kind of where it is most appropriate versus kind of like, where you have political people who like this the most at the time. I think it's great that like Detroit's moving ahead with it now. That's kind of ideal. But I think the other side, just being like other possible structures there. We currently in Colorado, just in the last couple of years passed this property value exemption of, I forget what, like 50,000 or something like that. Like, that would be a very, very small step and would lose a lot of the benefits of like doing a more of a rate-based approach like this. But even that, if we could just like apply that to improvements rather than to land and improvements, I think that is like the smallest shift in the right direction. And then also like just another idea that I've heard before that I think might be a little bit more politically viable while still capturing a lot of the benefits is, do you kind of like cap property values and say this extra charge is only on, oops, sorry, everyone online. Do you say like, we're gonna basically like allow, 3% growth in your land values per year or something like that. Anything above that, we're applying this surcharge to. Towards trying to get towards some of that challenge of, people who might see an immediate increase in their tax rates and kind of getting around that.
Excellent. Thank you all for tuning in. And for the folks in the room, Luke, we have a gift for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dave,
Thank you.